Hi, everyone. After such a riveting introduction, I think we're all pretty set for a really interesting discussion today. Thanks so much for joining us. We know there's lots of interesting stuff happening right now, so we're happy to have you here. So it is an honor to kick off a discussion on spotlighting climate, environment, and security. It's been really great to see this be a subject that's been very focused on in the past couple of days, so we're happy that you're here to discuss it even a little bit further. My name is Maya Jbeile. I'm the Reuters bureau chief for Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, based in Beirut. I was formerly for a year a correspondent covering climate for the Thomson Reuters Foundation around the region, which was quite an eye-opening experience, and I'll be bringing a little bit of that experience into our discussion today, but it's much more about these esteemed panelists that we have. We have in front of us Wim Wijnenberg, Humanitarian and Disarmament Project at PAX, a Dutch peace organization, and is also contributing to Bellingcat, which is a project that I'm sure many of you have heard of that is working on open source investigations. We have Carolina Eklöf, who's at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And we have Pete Schwartzstein at the Center for Climate and Security, who's also a journalist who is focused extensively on climate. So together today we're going to be discussing the nexus between climate, environment, and security. A lot of us have seen over the past year some pretty major climate impacts that have had us thinking about these interactions more and more and those intersections more and more. And just a show of hands, who in the room is a journalist? Almost, okay, good amount. Who already covers climate? Okay, who covers conflict? Who covers both? One? Okay, interesting. All right, so I think we're gonna have a really interesting discussion today because there might be some interest in seeing how those things overlap. So to kick us off, actually, I'm gonna start with a very kind of fundamental question to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing today. So Pete, if you could kick us off with what we actually mean when we say climate security. As a journalist, how has it been done correctly when it has been covered, and has it been generally undercovered over the past couple of years?
Yeah, thank you. That's a little bit of a poison chalice of a question. It's enormous, and I could quite easily bore you with a lot of fluff. But in short, climate security is perhaps the most kind of in-your-face manifestation of climate change. It's looking at the many different ways and many different forms in which climate change is contributing to violence and instability and insecurity in different parts of the world. Now, when we say conflict and when we say instability, we mean conflict and instability in their broadest forms. Now, this can extend from some of the better-known examples and illustrations of climate change's contribution to insecurity, like Syria, which is one of the more complicated examples that we might talk about a little bit later. It can extend to crime. There's a number of places around the world in which gangland violence, in which gender-based violence has been fueled or worsened in some instances on account of various climate drivers. And it can mean a lot of, perhaps the biggest way in which this is manifesting itself is just tensions at a kind of more localized level between different communities, generally in rural areas, as they tussle for resources, which are sometimes becoming scarcer, but more often than not fluctuating. There was a follow-on bit of the question, wasn't there?
It's been undercovered in the past couple of decades, obviously, but now I think we're seeing people cover it more and more. Are people doing it right when they are covering it, or not yet?
Yeah,
and why not?
There's been this sort of slightly bitter irony that climate security has been woefully underreported on a media level, and then on many of the occasions when it has been covered, it hasn't been covered in a particularly good way. Now, part of that, to my mind, is an illustration of the relative newness of climate security as a field. Until quite recently, it was pretty contained within military and mostly in a certain kind of scholarly circles. I mean, the Pentagon, and particularly the US Navy, along with some European militaries, has been at the absolute forefront of this, and it's relatively recently that this has just seeped into other spaces. But to my mind, it's also an illustration of the limitations of media. Like, climate security is a very complicated field. It's a field in which data often is of little use in telling the story. It's a a subject that requires considerable nuance, and the nature of media with those sort of sometimes limited word counts and the kind of necessity to have that kind of key quote at various junctures has meant that we've often gone without that, and it's just given rise to a certain sensationalism and a certain alarmism that we might talk about a little bit later.
Absolutely. So guys, keep in mind questions as we go through, because I would love to hear towards the end of the panel if you have anything that you wanted to ask the speaker. So we've factored that in, so please do think as you go through. Carolina, I'm going to ask, kind of shifting over to the policymaker side. So I think what's really great about the array that we have today is we have journalists represented, researchers represented, and kind of a policy making perspective represented as well. What does climate security look like for policymakers today, and what is the possible collaboration with journalists there?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, I feel like an odd bird not being a journalist here in Perugia, working for a research institute in Sweden, as Maya mentioned, SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And I can use that, first of all, as an example. It's an institute working closely with diplomats and academia on traditional security. Since the 1960s, it's been about weapons, nuclear risks of mass destruction, and as we are approaching the 2010-2020, suddenly there was an opening, and contemporary security issues like cyber, also climate, has suddenly started to make the agenda, and so in research that we do and in the conversations with policymakers that we have. And for example, in the United Nations Security Council, in the beginning of the 2000s, there were a few odd states bringing up climate now and then to the Security Council, the UK, Pakistan, trying to make the argument, and it wasn't really that attractive back then, but unfortunately, as time unfolds now in 2015 onwards, there's been a huge uptick in the appetite for this, and countries no longer need the same kind of arguments for why it's a problem. And in 2018, for instance, with Greta Thunberg, simultaneously as we had extreme wildfires, and regardless of where you lived, you could actually see the impacts of climate change taking place in your backyard. Suddenly, by now, in 2022, we have more than half of the UN's member states actually being behind this agenda of climate and security. So there's no longer this sort of tension as before. But what I want to say already now in the outset is that climate and security, it's kind of it's an idea, it's a campaign, it's a kind of it's a concept. But once you're starting to try to create the practical tools and policymakers try to approach it, it's hard to really know what to do. Because it's so contemporary, so new, it's almost like the internet. How do you, in the 1990s, people were like, what's the internet? And now it's like, okay, climate change, it has implications on security. What do we do? So that's the situation we're in.
And it seems like at least there's a parallel between the policymaking discussion and the media representation of these issues, where suddenly there's a shared urgency over this because we're seeing the actual impact. So because in the past year we've seen forest fires everywhere, because we've seen floods and droughts and heat waves and people dealing with heat waves and unfortunately death and displacement that are related to that, I think both policymakers and then readers or viewers who are media consumers otherwise, suddenly it's on their agenda because they actually have to think about it as an impact of this long-standing trend. You talked about tools, so I think it's a perfect segue to Wim to show us a little bit on the screen, but also discuss why data visualization in particular is important for this. I know there's been a couple of sessions about use of data. I think journalists are more and more interested in trying to visualize the stories that they're telling if they can't visualize them in photo and video, to use data even more. And this is a really interesting kind of story to tell with data. Why is it important for researchers and journalists and policymakers to tell the climate security story through data? And what have been your favorite tools as you've kind of, and we've talked about this a lot when I was reporting. What have been your favorite tools to help journalists visualize what they otherwise have struggled to visualize?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think that it's very essential in terms of doing reporting or investigating. And I hope the data is visible on the screen. Yeah. Thanks. So basically, the organization I work for, PAX, we're a Dutch peace organization, but in the work we were doing on like weapons-related impacts in various conflict areas, we also came across around the environmental damage and later also the climate-related impacts. And it was very helpful to get that story out, is to visualize these kind of problems. So because it makes it more tangible. And over the course, and particularly in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, in particular through the work we're doing with Bellingcat as well, is like there was a wealth of open source data, including satellite imagery, that was very helpful for investigations. And I'll quickly run through, because I don't want to bore you too much with the presentation, but it's helpful just to give you some tools and tips and tricks where if you want to look into some issues you're working on in conflict areas or in climate affected areas where you can go to. Again, we only have an hour here and I just have a couple of minutes for this, but just to give you sort of flavor of what you can use. So here, for example, is a good an illustration of something it's in 2018 in the north of Syria. So the green area here is all like healthy vegetation in Turkey. You clearly see the border with northeast Syria. The south of that, there's like burnt land, burnt agricultural land, because it was extremely dry year and there was a lot of wildfires there. But it also shows like what the capacity is of a state to deal with wildfires. One state who has the capacity, who has water, and the other state, there was actually the Kurdish-led self-administration, we didn't have the capacity. So you can see quickly how that makes a difference between two countries, two states' capacities to deal with that. So. I quickly have an overview. I'll quickly walk through it just to give you a sense where you can go to. Like it's very complex. There's a lot of stuff to get there, but just if you're interested, you can dive into it a bit more later. So you can look into like the application of climate data sets and satellite imagery. So look at the area, like where is your interest in, and you can zoom in. You can make a distinction. You can look at how climate or conflict has an impact on, is it on how the natural degradation impact natural resources. So if there's increased heat or is lack of rainfall, it will impact agriculture, it will impact access to clean water. Is it a long-term issue? Is like, do we see a trend where drought's going up, or are there incidents like the wildfires we've seen, which were like particularly intense in 2018? And it's of course another problem is like correlation versus causation. Like, is what's happening? Is it linked with climate, or is it something else? So that makes it more complex. And the other speakers also have much more to add to that discussion. But it's important to dive into when you're doing your research. Where to get the data? So there's really a wealth of petabytes of data now being made available online. Various UN institutions have it. They have the Global Forest Watch. You have the FAO looking at various data platforms where you can get information on food security. There's the World Bank. UN Environment has their environmental situation room, which you can have all kind of data. Again, it's a lot of complex issue, but just go there, try out. They make things really more user-friendly for people to access it and to check it out, and in particular for journalists. It's like it's a first stage you can get into to look into, okay, does it have information on the area I work on? And then you can always contact experts later to take that deep dive. But there is so much available, and we use it all the time also in our own research. This Global Research Foundation, like World Research Institute, has data. They have the Global Forest Watch. Google Earth Engine has accessible scripts you can run and try out if you want to dive a bit more deeper. The regional data sets, I'll show some example later. There's satellite imagery from NASA, has Landsat mode satellite imagery, which shows like burnt area indexes quickly, like every week it's updated. You can actually see live fire watches. I'll show you an example later. Sentinel Hub, which has all the European Space Agency, is free satellite imagery from Sentinel-2, which is optical imagery. Sentinel-1, which is radar imagery, so you can look at flooding. Sentinel-5P, we can look at air pollution. Commercial high-resolution imagery, if you want to take a more deep dive or like show something on the ground. Here's an example from last year, where Pete and I were doing an investigation we're traveling in northeast Syria looking at the impact of drought on farmers and pastoralists, and we were interviewing this group of, I think it was a Syrian community of farmers, and they were telling us about how the drought impacted them. But they also told us, well, it got worse because there's the Khabur River here, which comes from Turkey, which was dammed by Syrian National Army, which is a Turkey-backed rebel group, which made the situation even worse. And in this case, I think we're back in the car, and I could immediately check with Sentinel Hub, like, oh, because they told me like when the dams were being built, so we could quickly check, and we found out indeed there were 3 dams built, and you can see here the top area where the dams were built, and the south area is where the farmers were living. And also, again, more data here on, you can look at global trends to local events. So here 2 images. One shows like the drought index from the European Space Agency, which has sort of emergency service where you can look at, okay, where is the drought getting worse this year? And the other example is where we looked at South Sudan, where there's an increase of flooding over the last couple of years. And last year, before the flooding started, we already started mapping the risk of flood areas, and we could see there were a lot of oil fields that were risk of being flooded. So here you see an image which is made with Sentinel-2 free imagery. We use high resolution imagery from Google Earth to identify where all the oil extraction sites were, and you can see like all the black area here, which was flooded. Last example, again, the wildfires. So you have heat maps which shows where the risks are on the top left corner, top right corner. You see NASA fireborne data where you can see like it's where fires are happening. Left bottom corner, again, you see all the risk areas also again from the EU, and the south, the east, the right corner, too much geo. You can see like the increase of wildfires in Turkey over the years. So there you see a pattern and trend. And just as a last visualization, because Pete dropped a cigarette in the forest, and this is what happened in Greece. No, it's like it shows like This is like a really helpful tool for journalists to show the impact of the fires in a country itself. Like it's helpful as a journalist to show, you can talk about fires, but you can also show the size of an area which has been impacted and the sort of the visual message from it. So it's a very brief introduction, but just to set the stage a little bit on the opportunities that journalists have and researchers have from open source data to just explore specific things you're interested in.
I really appreciate how quickly you did that, honestly, Ren. Thank you. I mean, it's arguably probably the most interesting part of the presentation today, and I think is a crucial way to get people to actually pay attention, when you can visualize things like that, and not just in images, but also in videos, time lapses, etc. I think that's where we see that news consumers are actually engaging the most with this story by being able to actually see it visually. I'm gonna switch a little bit and do a little kind of time lapse and go back in time with Pete to talk about a kind of seminal moment possibly in the climate security reporting, kind of the recent history in that issue. So it's climate itself has been controversial, obviously, and remains such a controversial subject, unfortunately. But the case in Syria in particular stands out because as far as I can remember, I mean, it's the first time that people were really so clearly linking drought and food security issues to popular unrest and then kind of the conflict that unraveled after that. So it's an interesting moment to kind of talk about as a case study. Did it set a precedent that was helpful or that was problematic for kind of everything that happened afterwards, not just in the Middle East, but kind of beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, for many of us in the climate security world, there can be a temptation to try and run away from anything Syria related at this point, because for the best part of the past decade, the Syria discussion just dominated much of the climate security space, often to the exclusion of other areas. Now that's partly, I think, because it came along at a time when interest in climate security was picking up, and here all of a sudden was like seemingly a kind of a slam dunk illustration of the ways in which climate change can contribute to violence.
Which are, maybe we can lay it out.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, but the reality is that climate change did indeed play a considerable part in the war in Syria. Now, the conventional narrative goes that kind of increased drought, part of a kind of 10-year period in which rainfall fell dramatically in the run-up towards the revolution, pushed many rural Syrians out of their villages, out of their communities, and into the slum districts of many of Syria's sort of growing and deeply unhappy cities. Now, that narrative is not incorrect per se, but it's very un-nuanced and was, of course, prone to extreme sensationalism. And what happened, as many of you likely remember, was you had a number of public figures, the likes of the UN Secretary General, the likes of Prince Charles, who, I mean, whether this was a deliberate thing or just throwaway comments, spoke of Syria as a climate war. And that was the sort of thing that, not super surprisingly, inspired tremendous amounts of blowback, a blowback that we in the climate security community are still dealing with. And it inspired blowback for two reasons, one of which, of course, is that it's not wholly accurate. Nobody within the climate security space was suggesting that Syria was a climate-related conflict and climate-related conflict alone. We were suggesting that it had played a contributing part. But secondly, and this is a very legitimate fear, in Syria and elsewhere, there's the sense that climate change can provide a very convenient foil for the failures of dictators, for the failures of governments whose own governance failures are principally responsible for various conflicts and various tensions. And yeah, early on in the Syrian conflict, Bashar al-Assad addressed the Syrian parliament, invoking climate change as a key driver of the instability that was rocking parts of the country. And this, very understandably, aroused fierce opposition from many Syrians who quite correctly saw his misgovernance and his brutality, and ironically, his misresponses to a lot of the climate challenges that were roiling the country as kind of underlying the kind of heart of the conflict. So yeah, I think the sort of too long didn't read of it all is that climate change was indeed and remains a driver of Syria's war. But yeah, this sort of overstating of the case within a Syrian context and overstating of the case elsewhere is profoundly unhelpful and is the kind of thing that inspires the kind of contrarian blowback that a lot of us are still dealing with.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. And actually, I'm just going to tack on a question to Wim at the end of that. I mean, since Syria is the perfect example, actually, for you of times that you've used online and on-the-ground tools. Is it necessary to use both? Are there times where maybe in Syria, access is quite difficult, so you end up getting stuck using only digital tools? Access obviously became more and more difficult after the conflict ticked off, but you did manage to get onto the ground. Can you lay out for people in the room, how important it is to be able to have both? Can you rely as a journalist in your reporting on one of the two, or do you have to be able to access both? And if you can't get there physically, if you can't get a visa to that country, if you can't sneak in or whatever it takes, are there ways that you can creatively find alternatives on the ground to get continuous, updated, and especially reliable information from these areas that are conflict-ridden?
Yeah, I think that's of course, the second stage of the research. Like you can use digital tools, you can use remote sensing, like satellite data, to see changes, and you can detect changes. For example, I'll give you one example from Syria. We were looking into oil pollution, and I thought, like, okay, this is the big thing where people are concerned about in northeast Syria, because there's a lot of dumping from oil waste, because the oil industry was bombed there. There was like tens of thousands of makeshift refineries where civilians were working in for a long period until they were shut down a couple of years ago. So I thought, like, this is the biggest issue, and then we went there and we spoke with people, and people mentioned, like, yeah, it's an issue, oil pollution, it affects water, but the biggest issue here is actually the lack of environmental governance. So there's no waste management, people are burning open waste. This is something we struggle with the most. And that was a discrepancy between what I thought was the biggest issue because of your own narrow view until what the reality was, and which is like, people saw the issue as from pollution from the oil industry, but like the waste had a bigger impact because it clogged up all the rivers. But it's something you can't necessarily always see with satellite imagery. But in having that knowledge, then we went back to satellite imagery and we looked at, okay, where are all the solid waste sites? And we were able to identify like a growing amount of solid waste sites somewhere close to urban areas. People were doing open waste burning, and you could understand where the air pollution had a more direct impact on people's life because of respiratory problems, because of communicable diseases that were spreading. And that's the stuff you don't see on satellite imagery. Another thing is important is also you can see change, but you can't always see what the impact of the change is. So for example, there can be drought, there can be a deforestation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is always a huge problem for people, because people tend to be quite resilient. Communities are able to deal with things because they face it multiple times in their lifetime. They're able to find ways around it. So maybe I can detect forest change remotely or with digital tools, but it doesn't always tell you what the impact is on people. And that's why journalism on the ground is needed to go for stories, to understand what is actually happening, how big is it, are there other issues at play. I think that's why the combination is helpful. But at least satellite imagery, particularly in conflict-affected areas where you don't have access, you can try to understand what is happening by looking at it and see these changes, which can be a first clue to look into and dive into something further, and you can find more information there. Sometimes it would have an impact, and you do see that drought actually, like the shortage of water is affecting farmers. But like, the research we did on pastoralists is something which was hardly covered. So in northeast Syria, or in the whole of Syria and Iraq as well last year, everyone was indeed going to talk with farmers, but the pastoralist is a community which is covered less so, because it's more difficult to look at cattle or how livestock is impacted, because it's hard to track that from satellite imagery. I can show there's no vegetation growth because there's no rain, so that's very easy to do, but you have to think further that actually there's a lot of people with livestock and communities are built around that which are affected. So I think that's why there always is a need for people on the ground to investigate it. And you can help, like I mentioned earlier, you can use the visual tools to illustrate the changes, but then on the ground it's needed to show what the changes mean for people.
A quick follow-up on that, because I think we're doing okay with time, so I'll just take my prerogative and ask a quick follow-up. How important is it to have somebody, I mean, so in your example, where you guys were traveling across northeast Syria together, and you were able to piggyback off of each other's knowledge and each other's skill sets and perspectives, is that the only way to do it? Or if you're outside of a country and you literally cannot get in, is there a way, is the information that you're seeking so specific and so kind of particular that you wouldn't be able to train somebody online to kind of get that information for you if you need it, whether you're a journalist or whether you're a researcher? Is it possible to kind of remotely convey to somebody, okay, I need you to ask these particular questions and look for that particular piece of information? Is that feasible for a context, let's say, like Syria, like Iraq, like Yemen, places that are difficult to reach? Either one, anyone. We're just chaos now. So.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, no two climate-related conflicts, no two climate-related security situations are alike. However, in general, and in my personal experience, it's exceptionally difficult to do justice to the severity or the nature of a climate-related conflict without ground reporting. Now, that can be in support of a lot of kind of pre-existing remote sensing analysis. However, I mean, just looking back at some of the work that I've done, because proving climate conflict and climate insecurity links can be so intensely difficult, I've often only felt comfortable and confident in making these quite grandiose sounding claims after visiting time and again many of the same communities, often over an extended period of time. Because people, again, in many instances, don't explicitly come out and say kind of climate change or environmental problems are contributing to security problems in my area. They're not contributing to my migration. In the end, your take is the kind of end result, it's the net result of the hundreds or more interviews that you've conducted over an extended period. You've ultimately just had the confidence off the back of that extensive on-the-ground reporting to make a claim that isn't necessarily summed up by any one quote or any one interview here or there. So that's my particular take, though I 100% agree that remote sensing and internet tools can certainly aid and in some instances form the bedrock of a climate security investigation.
No, I think what's helpful, all our work, we work with local partners, and what I've seen also in northeast Syria and Iraq, there's a growing movement of civil society organizations which don't necessarily have a specific environmental angle, but environment's part of their work, and maybe you can't always frame it around indeed what Pete said. You don't call it climate or you don't call it environment, but it's more a livelihood concern, and people look at it from a water perspective or look at it from an agricultural perspective, and in these kinds of conversations, they provide a lot of information or clues that can look at, okay, well, we can see that the patterns of rains are changing, like it's getting more unpredictable, and that kind of information is already helpful, and people don't necessarily frame it because we're coming from this research academic perspective to put it in that frame. But then talking with those kind of groups, and they feel it every day in their life. They can see the situations deteriorating. There is the governance is collapsing, and it's impacting, in particular with more and more youth groups in the Arab world are getting more active on this, which is also stimulating as well, and because they have a growing understanding of like the wider policy debate, it's easier to connect with them and work with them. For example, our partners in Northeast Syria, they're very keen to get a training on using remote sensing data just to help, just you know, where they can identify changes, they can help spot things, they can map it better, and it gives them also a better opportunity to engage with local authorities, saying, okay, we've been tracking this in this whole area. We've looked at all these issues. We can send people to certain locations where there's pollution or where there's water shortages, and we have substantial data to also engage with local authorities for their own advocacy, and that's where it's helping them. And it's the same in Iraq as well. There's great initiatives. But in Iraq, there's a really great organization, Huma Dijala, who's really doing good work on all kinds of water issues, and they're getting more recognition, but also at the same time, it's getting also, in particular, more repressive states, environmentalists, or also climate environmentalists, and the civil society groups are facing prosecution. So also that's where the environmental defenders come in. And just before the lunch, we had a good conversation about Iran, which is still sort of a black hole in terms of climate data, because it's so difficult to get information, to work with environmentalists in Iran, because they're getting prosecuted. But that's where climate security is going to be a really big problem. There's already people went to the streets years after year to protest the drought, to protest agricultural change, and people are going more to this bigger urbanization from the countryside. But it's so difficult there to work with people, and that's where perhaps remote sensing is, for example, a tool to support that, at least from a distance, and also for journalists to do that kind of work.
Yeah, I think we can open up a really interesting discussion on sourcing and on obviously the dangers that it poses to researchers and to activists who are working in contexts, as Pete pointed as well, where the government or the authorities have an interest in kind of passing on, you know, the impacts of their mismanagement and saying actually climate is the scapegoat. And people pick up on that, and people report it solely in that framework without trying to balance and say, okay, climate is obviously exacerbating the issue, and you have maybe less rainwater to deal with than you ever had before, but your management of it is actually causing the acute problem right now of people not having water in their taps. So I think we can talk about the sourcing issue as well in a bit, but I did want to turn to Carolina first and talk about and touch on some of the things, you know, this theme that was brought up about this kind of sensationalism of climate, and you talked about it as well in your opening remarks, the sensationalism of climate security reporting. Does that exist in the research sphere as well, or in the policymaking sphere as well, where you know, there's a kind of dramatization of the impact or dramatization of the kind of possible security risks, and in the end, is that really beneficial? I mean, if we're only thinking about climate in terms of, you know, it's obviously more urgent to think about it in terms of its security risks, right? If you've got massive population movements, or if you've got possible conflict breaking out because of it. But does it ultimately kind of protect us more to only think about it when there's an immediate security problem? What's the kind of what's the parallel version of that in the research and policy making world?
Yeah, thank you. No, absolutely, there's a sensationalist trend that exists in research as well. But I would say, I mean, in general, the less sensational, the more serious the research. It's usually like that, and then it's up to the receivers, the journalists, the media to actually make sense. What's the news here? And sort of course, I mean, just to throw it out there, that I think researchers love to pick up a phone call from a journalist and actually get to explain what they couldn't put in the text, and you know, so on. But there's back in the 90s or so, when climate security or environment and security and peace and so on began to become like an academic issue, there was some particular academic, Somer Dixon, for instance, who had this idea of climate wars. So in the 90s, obviously, what you had theory, like, oh yes, in 30 years or 50 years, there's going to be climate wars. And I mean, now we're there, and we're like, there's not really climate wars. And I think that when this came out, it was over dramatized, and it couldn't be really taken seriously either, because it wasn't so nuanced. But now we're here, and we see the impacts, and we have a whole different way of interacting with the issue. But as Wim and Pete were saying, that there's a high burden of proof when it comes to climate reporting, whether in research or journalism. And I think that in particular for academia, the burden of proof is particular when it comes to be able to claim that there's science. And that means that it's very slow. And climate is a fast issue. I mean, nature used to move slowly and societies changed fast. And now nature is changing quickly and societies are changing too slow. And that's where research too, by its nature, it has to be slow, otherwise it might not be correct. But that's where I think that journalism is so important, because it can do this sort of, a story from one person can be as true as a sample of 1,000 claiming that, which takes years to come up with. So yeah, about Iran, for instance, with this data lack of access and so on, and that's a real issue when it comes to research. But reaching out as a journalist and finding someone can actually penetrate that. And if I'm going to say anything more on kind of something that I've been exposed to in research that might be useful in journalism, is to think of climate change and climate security, environment and peace, and these issues, of course, not just on climate, but on a broader sort of environment, biodiversity, pollution. How is that actually impacting us, and broader than security as well? So can we actually build peaceful societies through sustainability, and can it actually contribute to something positive? But to find these sort of ins or these stories, I would just like to mention that think about spatial and temporal dimensions. So can this be looked at from a spatial point of view? Has this risk traveled over areas? Has it traveled over regions? And temporal dimensions, is this something that is happening in the next few weeks or the next decades? So some ideas.
And you've used those in your discussions with policymakers as well. I mean, is that how you try to kind of not fall into the sensationalism, but try to keep it urgent when you are having those discussions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of things that it's very different from country to country and actor to actor what is relevant when it comes to this. I mean, you look at the Pacific Islands or Fiji, for instance. I mean, for them, it's all about it's an existential risk. You can't argue with that. And for other parts of the world, as was mentioned before, there's a lot of attention that has been put on Africa and the Middle East when it comes to this issue. And there we have this sort of farmer, herder, pastoralist, and also other kind of community ways of organizing and ways of decision making and societies. But you have also, I mean, obviously Latin America is very under researched from my point of view when it comes to this. There you have a whole different dynamic, much more urban kind of problems and development projects that are taking place with massive funding from governments that have not considered how this actually impacts the populations.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue for us to get into our next discussion, because we have focused, as you guys have noticed, a lot on the Middle East. I think because a lot of the collective experience that's up here today has been in that region, but we would like to expand it out. So Pete, before I kind of circle back to you for a kind of bigger picture takeaway. Pete, obviously we've been talking a lot, and I'm sure many of you guys have noticed that a lot of the discussion in the past couple of weeks on Ukraine has been about food security. There have been obviously some kind of environmental risk questions as well. So what are the environmental security ramifications of the conflict in Ukraine? What should journalists be looking out for in terms of specific climate security risks? Not to give away your stories if you're working on any, but kind of what should be on people's radars in this particular context, and then kind of more broadly if you have other points to share as well.
Yeah, I'd say there's, I mean, when it comes to Ukraine, there's an indirect and a direct consequence for the kind of environmental and climate security world, and as navel gazing as it sounds, I actually perceive that indirect risk to be much the worst. And it's the fact that, once again, at a time when climate action and climate security action is more important than ever, climate change has just completely fallen from the headlines. At a time when we need to be reining in fossil fuel use to the most extraordinary extent and just sort of launching into mitigation adaptation in a way that we never previously have, instead countries are ramping up lignite production, they're ramping up their pursuit of fossil fuels. There's a tendency when you've got a hammer to look at every problem like a nail, but the basic reality is that climate change is the problem, and given the show of hands earlier, I don't think anybody in this room needs convincing of the severity of the situation. But I mean, if you're checking out our newspapers, climate change has fallen off the first few pages. It's sort of enmeshed back around page 10 in a way that it was 5-10 years ago. And this is dispiriting in the extreme. From a direct perspective, the effects are a little bit more localized. I know we want to move a little bit away from the Middle East as a sort of geographic setting. However, from a food security point of view, there is no part of the world that is more vulnerable to the food fallout of this invasion than the Middle East and North Africa. And that's because they are countries with, in most instances, relatively limited agricultural resources and relatively big populations that also have a certain proximity to the Black Sea region, which has meant that imports from Ukraine and Russia are more economically viable than they are from other big global wheat exporters like the US and Australia and France. And that has meant that they are uniquely poorly placed to deal with this kind of new crunch. I don't know if you all remember the 2007-2008 global food price spike. That was a combination of failed harvests in a number of key global bread baskets, coupled with a rise in energy prices and a number of other things. So looking at this in a global context, all it will take later in the year to kind of add to already sky-high food prices is yet another drought-induced crop failure in another one or two of the global grain exporters to pitch this into a kind of a level of crisis that we didn't even experience back in 2007, 2008. Again, one of the other areas that many climate security researchers have been a little bit wary of getting enmeshed in is the debate about the extent to which climate-induced high food prices contributed to the Arab Spring uprisings in the first place. There's been a fair bit of un-nuanced, not wonderful reporting in that area. At the same time, again, it's not nonsense. There's something to it. And if you look around, if you look at Sri Lanka, if you look at Pakistan, areas where there were a number of serious pre-existing problems even before late February and the Russian invasion, it seems that a lot of the kind of knock-on consequences of this conflict have already kind of exacerbated those situations and are contributing to instability. And I would expect to see that as a prelude to many similar events elsewhere later in the year.
I mean, as having been in Lebanon over the past couple of years and seeing how unresilient the economy and society is there from an energy perspective, from a food security perspective, you just keep thinking that if they had become more sustainable and resilient for the right reasons from the get-go, they wouldn't have had to go through a lot of the extremely painful experiences that Lebanon has gone through in the past couple of years.
Yeah, well, actually, talking about this, I'm also wondering, we also see it happening in Europe as well, like the last couple of years where there have been, like even now there was a warning last week in Netherlands that the groundwater levels were getting really low, like extremely low. 2 years ago in Germany, we saw like an impact of like low groundwater levels and lack of rain on harvests as well. And we see now indeed the crop prices are growing. And what does it mean on social stability, for example, in Europe, where you have a group of people that, like, between the haves and the have-nots, like people are, if you have a low income and the prices go up with 10-20%, you have an issue because you struggle with getting your elementary groceries and pay your bills. Well, you also have like a middle class and upper class, which for whom it's less of a problem. And there are also politicians trying to exploit that. Like, so politicians for political reasons trying to say, well, you know, if you want to if you want to keep things as they are, like vote for us, and those are more right-wing and sort of neo-fascist groups who are sort of trying to play on this kind of things. But those changes between the haves and have-nots in Europe is already happening. And there also you see that climate change will have impact on societies as well. So that's not even far from home, and we'll probably see that. And that's sort of, you see a multiplied effect from like lack of import from traditional areas because climate's impacting there as well, and because of wars and other issues. But I think also here in Europe, it will be driving more societal and political tensions, and not necessarily, well, I hope not necessarily conflicts, but like it will create more a rift between different social groups. At the same time, going to other areas, like that's the stuff where I mentioned in the research we're doing in South Sudan, where you do have like weak environmental governance or a failed state that's not capable of dealing with, for example, its oil industry, where the climate change is and the flooding is exacerbating those kind of problems, where the war is sort of driving people more south. For example, you see like the conflict and the internal conflict in 2013, 2014 led to a massive influx of refugees into Uganda, which also again needed a lot of trees for cooking, which created more tensions with local communities because they lost a lot of forest there because of the IDP camps or refugee camps cutting down all these trees. So there's a kind of problems you see there, and also in stuff we're doing on so research on DRC, where more and more pastoralists are crossing the border, entering areas where agriculture is more affected by large livestock groups and creating more tensions, and that's something you're seeing in a lot of parts of Africa as well, where movements of people, that's affecting livelihoods, and it's creating political tension and sometimes armed violence, and that's and we haven't even touched Southeast Asia, but I've just read about the kind of things there, and I would be really interested to hear from journalists or researchers more like what are the consequences there.
I have some follow-up questions, but before I do, are there questions in the room? Otherwise, I'll just keep talking forever. But I just want to get a sense of if there's people that want to. No, you're going to let me ask all the questions? Okay, I'm happy to do that. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. So, I'm actually what you raised, when you're talking about the different stages. Let's say you have a drought that spurs, let's say, population movement because farmers maybe even temporarily are going to move away from a certain plot of land. They end up then heading towards somewhere and straining the limited resources there even further. So you've got this kind of snowballing effect. In my experience, I was with AFP prior to joining Thomson Reuters. And I lived in Iraq at the time, but I wasn't covering much climate. But I would get these kind of requests from editors if I was pitching something related to drought or related to some kind of climate impact. They'd be like, well, how do you prove that it's climate? Like, how do you definitively prove it? Like, the reason that we're seeing this thing and the reason that there's conflict and the reason that these tribes are fighting over water and whatever is related to climate. And what happened when I switched over to a team at Thomson Reuters called the Thomson Reuters Foundation that had a climate editor was I had somebody directly that I was in direct contact with who understood that it's not necessarily a cause. You can't represent it necessarily with cause and effect in that way. I can't say that like because there was X percentage less rainfall this year, these 5 tribes started to fight each other more. You can't do that. So it was really important to me and really eye-opening for me to see that an editor that understands the basics and understands and understands what climate impacts mean and what they can look like across different contexts will not ask a journalist to prove something that we can't actually necessarily prove. So to come back to you, to ask, you've worked with journalists a lot in the past couple of years on in a variety of contexts on climate security related issues. What are the most common mistakes that you found were being made either by the journalists or by their institutions? Did that ever kind of trickle down to you where they were like, yeah, but how do I prove that? Were they asking you to provide them with evidence that that is not appropriate for that context? And just so that we're not only negative, what are some examples of positive collaboration as well, besides Pete and me?
I think that you already addressed something is like sensationalism. Well, okay, you know what I mean. That's something that for journalists want to have really sharp headlines, which misses the nuance. To give one example from last year with the drought in Syria, it was very easy, and to some extent, there might be some truth in it, but like frame it around Turkey is shutting down water because they want to deliberately hit the Kurdish-controlled areas because Turkey doesn't like the Kurdish-led self-administration, so they shut down the water. And that sort of was driving a lot of headlines. At the same time, what a lot of people or journalists didn't look into, like Turkey was struggling with a drought as well. And there was, there was also related that Turkey set up a quite water-rich agricultural project in the 90s in the southeast of Turkey, which was to some extent, not sustainable at all. But they were diverting all the water from all the lakes and all the dams they built in the mountains to that area. A lot of water-rich cash crops were growing there, and that's because that is unsustainable. But they needed the water for their own industry, so they kept the water mostly to sustain their own industry because there are a lot of voters there, and there's a lot of social and economic interest. But it was very easy to frame this from outside, like it's very black and white. This Turkey wants to shut down the water because it's the self-administration or it's the Kurds, and that's the sort of simplification that you can try to fall into if you don't look into deeper what's behind it, like what are our states' motivations, what are people motivations. But also, like I mentioned in the beginning, like the resilience, like just because these things are happening doesn't mean that always people are able to cope with it. It makes them definitely it makes it more difficult, for sure. And also when we interviewed people there as well, like people want to leave the area, and people want to, we heard stories about the rise of suicides and people trying to get out of the country, which is, but it's a complex issue as well. It's also the lack of the political status of the area meant there's no investments coming in, people see no future, and it's not just water that's driving that, but it's just a general, it's again the compounding effect of the conflict itself on the lack of a political solution for the status of Northeast Syria, and the lack of like a prospect of economic development, and on top of that you get like this drought. And that's sort of, but the simplification in the headline is of course like, weaponization of water, a much used phrase. It's like, it sort of misses much of the context. The other side, I think, the plus side on that is, apart from this panel, I think the collaboration, it's like, for me, it's very helpful to engage with journalists because they have good networks on the ground, they can ask better questions. We can try to support them with data, or it works back as well. The journalists come to us, say like, hey, I'm in this area, can you help help me looking into this? For example, we did something with a journalist from PBS last year on, like, she was reporting on northeast Iraq, where like there was a lot of deforestation. The claim was deforestation linked with the Turkey building military bases there. And we could combine like high resolution imagery to show there was indeed forest loss because Turkey was building all these bases and had to build all these roads to these bases, and that was sort of, they cut down trees, but it was not as claimed, like whole areas being deforested. But that combination works well because she could interview people, I could pull up satellite imagery, and we could bring that nuance to the picture. And it's still, like, it's very problematic because people are drifting out of that area because of the military operations. There's agricultural loss because of the military operations from Turkey against PKK. So people, like normal people, are affected by that battle, but like that collaboration helps sort of bring much more nuance to it, I think. And yeah, again, and then what I mentioned in the beginning, the visualization and the helping that and sharing that information, the wealth of open source research and satellite imagery and data sets, I think that's something we can give back to journalists as well. Like, hey, this is how we did it, but you can do it yourself as well. And that's the whole point of doing this, and the work that we do and the work that Bellingcat does is training people on, we can do it, so you can do it as well. And please use it, it's there.
Thank you very much. I have one more question of Carolina, then I have one more round. Just again, checking questions, audience. We got a few. Okay, all right, so I'll speed it up so that I can make sure you guys can get your questions in as well. Carolina, I'm gonna kind of jump to the last question so that we can make sure that we can get everyone in. How are climate adaptation and green transitions relevant for peace? I mean, we've spent literally 50 minutes now talking about conflict. So is the positive kind of element of that relevant for peace as well? And honestly, how can journalists sell that to their editors? Obviously, if it bleeds, it leads. So how can you create a headline around peace and not just around conflict?
It's great to be the only one who's not a journalist, and I can help how to pitch something. Yeah. No, but I mean, I think I've heard this here in Perugia a lot, that like climate change, it's the story now. is the story of the 21st century. And on the one hand, there's the change that comes with climate, but there's also the change that comes with adapting to climate. And that's also its own, it has its own knock-on effects, and it's a separate issue, and it can lead to conflicts exactly like climate change in itself leads to changes that leads to conflict. So does the adaptation to climate. And as Maya mentioned, how can this change lead to peace? Well, basically, if there's going to be billions of dollars invested in adapting to climate change, and many of these dollars will go to fragile regions, there should be an impetus to actually think about and do a conflict analysis. How can this investment lead to peace rather than deepening the wounds? And this is obviously something that has been research on, and that there's proof that these kinds of things can also these kind of things can be extremely effective. The project that I'm working in is called Environment of Peace, and it does exactly that. Look into how can all our environmental actions, whether the environmental changes themselves or humanity's adaptation to the changes, affect populations and preferably also build peace. How can these changes actually evoke positive outcomes? So there's a huge, obviously there's a huge momentum now for everything climate, everything environment. Let's make sure that that also contributes to peace, and I think that that's a bit of a pitch.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes. I'm going to take the questions from the audience, and then I'm going to give everybody up here basically 1 minute to final thoughts, address any questions that have come up, just rapid fire. All right, you had a question? Oh yeah? Brilliant, it's super efficient. Do you anything else you want to throw out there? All right, brilliant. Great. I will repeat that question in a moment, and we have one question in the back. Yes.
So one of the panelists said that sometimes climate change becomes a foil for actual policy duration and policies not working. But many times reporting is either or. It blames climate change or it blames policy failure. How do you do an intersection and ensure that it's not either or?
Okay, excellent. Any last lingering? Yes. Excellent. I'm going to repeat them very, very quickly. So we had a first question, which was, besides Iran, which was mentioned as an example, what other countries are using climate as a scapegoat for possibly the mismanagement of natural resources, and where it's difficult for climate reporters or activists to carry out their work, where it becomes actually a security problem for them. Then we had a question about kind of similar vein, where some reporting can attribute an impact either to mismanagement or to a climate impact. Is there a way for journalists to kind of demonstrate fairly that nuance and to get at both? And then how do journalists who are reporting on kind of the higher level discussions on climate make sure to factor in the kind of the imbalance when it comes to the who has the mic basically when these discussions are happening? So I'm going to give each of you guys 1 minute. Okay, we'll do this. Graham?
Okay, I'm not sure if I have an answer to every question, but I think in another country, I think where it's difficult to report on, first comes to mind, like apart from Iran, I think Turkey is problematic because of the prosecution of journalists there, and they're under heavy stress, and also because it's a complicated issue. because of the water and because of the government dealing with this issue, which probably makes it difficult to properly report on. I think you have to give a good thought about other countries. The other issues that was addressed, I think one of the issues that we're seeing, and with all respect to the big think tanks, but much of the discussion is driven by Western think tanks, also in particular because they have access to international forums much better. I think we should really have more, and we're guilty of as well. I'm a white guy from a Western country talking about climate change, but like I really want to work more with local journalists, with local environmental activist groups, with local civil society organizations, or from affected countries. They should have more center stage in the discussions, and have an input in the discussion, should be listened to, because that's sort of missing in those. It's much more top-down policy things on climate action. I think that's where we need more empowerment of groups from civil society, groups from climate-affected countries. Definitely, that's the one thing I agree with, and we all should be working on more. And journalists can do more to reach out to this kind of groups. I think that's a job for journalists to, if you report on a country, talk with local civil society groups. Even if there aren't environmental groups, there are definitely always civil society groups dealing with either deforestation or with water, or with public health issues. Talk with doctors in countries. I think that would be my recommendation.
Right. Two questions that touched on securitization. In journalism, in environmental journalism, as in the environmental space in general, life is becoming significantly more difficult. Year by year, the number of environmental defenders killed in the course of their work is increasing, and while journalist troubles are not necessarily reflected in body bags, the number of arrests, the number of legal attacks, the number of physical assaults increases on a year by year basis. And I mean, again, the reasons for that are myriad. However, as climate shocks and non-climate related environmental problems become that bit more debilitating, governments and corporations and an array of others just seem to be that bit less willing to countenance reporting that they see as sort of upsetting their economic or political plans, and unfortunately that will likely become an even bigger fixture of the years ahead. Nigeria and Sudan are, to me, the two countries, in addition to Syria, that leap to mind as having used climate as a foil for their own failures. The Nigerian government has time and time again blamed climate change and climate change alone for the emergence of Boko Haram and an array of other climate kind of related instability in the country. And again, as in so many instances, it's not incorrect per se. There's a definitive climate link, but it's only a part of the wider story. I'll leave it at there.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, so I agree that on the one hand there's the environmental crisis, there's the security crisis, and then there's a governance deficit. Okay, so if governance was actually keeping the promises made, we might not have either of the other crises. And then on the UNSC, I definitely think that there's a lot of other things to. Okay, first of all, I agree that it's so extremely unfair, obviously, this system. But what would be interesting is to look at what are the arguments for the countries on why do I stand behind the agenda on climate, or why do I not stand behind this agenda? Because I think they're equally interesting. Why is this a topic, or why is it not a topic for security? And in general, securitization of anything can be dangerous, but climatization of security might be a better approach. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. I guess if you have any more questions, maybe we have time to take them on individually if you'd like to come up, but really appreciate you spending your Saturday afternoon with us today. Thank you.